for the Creation Celebration 2020. I'm Todd Wood. You've probably seen my face quite a bit today if you've been following along with the videos. And I'm here with Paul Garner. And Paul is beaming to us from his home across the pond, so it's quite late. But he looks pretty alert, so that's good.
Coffee.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. All right. Thank you. Looking forward to this. That's fantastic. If you see me looking up, I'm looking at all your text coming in on a different screen here. Marcus Ross, the director of creation studies at Liberty University, is definitely going to join us. Oh, here he is right now. Let me let him in. What do we got? Here he comes. Good evening, sir. And you're connected to audio, is that right?
I believe I am.
Yeah, I believe you. All right.
Oh, sorry for the last minute fly-in here.
Lynchburg traffic.
Yeah, which means Ward's Road traffic.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
There's only one place where there is traffic.
That's right.
It happens to be by my school. Oh, good to see you.
Yeah, good to see all you
Good
guys.
to see you too, Marcus.
Well.
It must be pretty late over in the UK right now.
Yeah, it's 11.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So we are streaming now. Marcus, you're at your office. Paul, you're in your home, I think.
I am.
And
yeah.
I'm at my office here at Core Academy. Over my shoulder, you might be noticing that weird stuff on the shelf. Those are hominin skulls, in case you were curious. So I might point out random other things as we go along through the weekend here. Well, we're supposed to be.
Might we.
What's that?
So might we.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so we are going to be, and I'm checking out other things. I've got people texting me messages from the email as this is happening. So this is our first time doing this, so this should be interesting. So let's get started with at least a question. Very simple question. Ha ha ha. If creation is a miracle, what can science tell us about it? If creation is a miracle, what can science tell us about it? Science can only deal with regularities and natural law, things that happen all the time, and miracles are outside of the realm of science. And what in the world does creation science have to say about miracles or creation or anything?
Do you want me to kick off? Do you want me to kick off with that then?
Yeah, go for it.
I think this is a good question because I think some people dismiss creationism because it invokes supernatural causation. So they see it as a kind of science showstopper. And it's certainly true that we can't investigate miracles scientifically in the lab. God is a spirit. He doesn't perform miracles on demand for scientists to study them.
I can't put him in my test tube.
Yeah, so
right.
all of that is absolutely true. But I don't think any of that precludes the fact that scientific evidence can point to a miraculous event having occurred. So, to give a kind of hypothetical example, imagine that you were a scientific observer at the wedding in Cana in Galilee where Jesus turns the water to wine. And imagine that you were able to sample what was in the jars immediately before and immediately after the miracle occurred. Now, even if the miracle itself wasn't directly accessible to you, I think you could infer that something pretty remarkable had happened. You would have evidence that pointed to something miraculous having occurred. And the same thing with the resurrection, which of course is the core of our faith. As Christians, we think that the resurrection is the best explanation of the empirical evidence of the data. So I think we can investigate those kinds of claims, and in fact, whenever our opponents, if you like, the critics of creationism, appeal to evidence against creationism, they are in effect conceding that creationism makes scientifically testable claims, because you can't appeal to evidence against something that is not testable by definition.
Love it when they do that.
The crucial thing for us, I think, is that we need to be able to come up with testable hypotheses. And claims like God created everything, while that's true, that's actually not a very scientifically useful statement. What we need to do is come up with specific claims, maybe about the origin of a particular rock unit, or about the relationship of two organisms, or something like that we can actually test by the scientific data.
Right.
So I don't think there's anything that precludes creationism being scientific in this sense, simply because it appeals to miraculous causation.
Yeah, and I think you hit on one of those things that not a pet peeve, but it's one of those things that I really kind of amuses me when people tell me in one breath creationism isn't science, it's outside the realm of science, can't test it, can't, there's no evidence for it. And then they'll turn around and they'll say, here's all the evidence that shows that creationism is false. And I think if there's evidence that it's false, then certainly it must be within some part of science can say something about it. It can't be that it's totally ascientific, right?
Yeah, it's a nice double-edged sword there, because if the Bible is ascientific, right, if it's outside the bounds of science, then obviously it couldn't have provided any means through which scientists, both in the present as well as in the past, could have guided any kind of research. A statement that is demonstrably false, right? We've got scores of scientists throughout history who have used very specific biblical concepts and statements in order to launch research programs. Just a simple example with someone like Carl Linné saying, I'm going to discover the animals that God created and I'm going to organize them. And so he comes up with a genus and species categorization that is expressly biblical. And so you go, okay, well, there's historical counter examples to this. And so that should mean that it's at least allowable that there are modern counter examples to that. If you want to say, on the other hand, that the Bible cannot guide research and cannot be part of science at all, then that's right, Todd. You don't get the opportunity to then say science disproves you. Right. If science can't prove you or disprove you, then it can't do either.
That's right, yeah.
Choose one wisely.
That's right.
And it's probably not going to be the one where science is unable to examine any claims of the Bible at all.
And yet I hear people so dogmatic about that. They're just absolutely certain that it's beyond the realm of science. And then they'll just turn around and give you all the reasons why the specific claims of creationism are wrong. Well, you just can't have it both ways. If it's beyond the region of science, then end. You cannot talk anymore about science of creation because there isn't any.
Yeah. If I can plug a book here real quick,
sure.
And I'll plug the one that's behind me in a little while, but we'll probably have a few book plugs along our discussion. But Leonard Brand talks about this rather nicely in his book, Faith, Reason, and Earth History, where he talks about science as something that is able to study effects. So we, as Paul was saying, right, we can't specifically know what happened to the jars in Cana when Jesus turns the water into wine. But the effect of that miracle is that there is, in fact, wine in these jars. The effect of God's creative work in creation means that there is a particular organization to life in some way that can, in fact, be studied. If there were miraculous events going on during the flood, which is obviously an open question amongst creationists right now, there would still be effects to those miraculous events. And the residue, the leftover, as far as some package of rock or a group of fossils or something else, is available, right? It's a physical object. That's well within the bounds of science.
All right. Yeah. Great. So sorry about that. Just checking my messages there. Let's try another question here. This one will be fun. How can we be sure about the diet of animals before the fall? Were they really vegetarians? And did Tyrannosaurus graze like a cow?
Hold on one sec. Paul, you can start talking. I got to grab something.
Okay.
Okay. Well, from a biblical perspective, we're told in Genesis 1 verses 29 and 30 what the original diet of both the humans and the animals was, and it was plants. Now, I know that some will argue that if we say they only ate plants, that this is an argument from silence, from what the Bible doesn't say. I'm not sure that's really true, because in Genesis chapter 9, after the flood, we have a kind of parallel situation here where Noah is like a new Adam in this new world, and God gives him many of the same kinds of instructions and commands that he gave to Adam in the beginning. And there's a command about diet, or an instruction about diet. Just as I gave you every green plant for food, now I give you all things. So it seems to me there is an explicit contrast being drawn in Genesis 9 that suggests something has changed. That there has been a change from the diet that was prescribed in Genesis chapter 1 compared to the diet in Genesis 9. One of the other clues, I think, that tells us that something had changed, and this is specifically with regards to the animals, is actually the account of the flood. Because Genesis 6 tells us that one of the reasons, the reason that God brought the flood as a judgment upon the world was because the world was full of violence and corruption. And we're told in Genesis 6 that all flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth. And clearly,
repetitive lines about the waters getting higher. So I wanted to run over and just grab a little something from my office over here. So we got a replica of a velociraptor skull. Yeah, this is part of the fun of teaching paleontology classes, is that you have some models available that you didn't have to purchase yourself. And when you take a look at this skull, the mouth is full of all of these nice little sharp teeth, and these are yes, I like the fact that it's right over my face here.
Yeah.
Even right through. Ooh, great. So you've got all these nasty little wickedly sharp teeth. This is not a salad shooter, right? This is not really good at chopping up leaves and vegetation. It's not eating cantaloupe and watermelon. This is an animal that doesn't chew, who can't chew, and has little serrations on both sides of those teeth. And I mean, you can use a steak knife to cut your carrots, but it's not the right tool for the job. And so thinking of something like Velociraptor as an organism that is buried and killed in Noah's flood, it points to that violence. And this is an animal that is built for speed and death. There kind of no two ways around it. And there's reasons why it's the stuff of Jurassic Park. It's an exciting, frightening kind of animal because it's deadly. There's no two ways around it. So by the time we have these things in the flood, we've got full-on carnivory. Now whether that was something that happened very quickly at the fall, or whether it was a degradative process in some way, no matter what, by the time we get to the flood, we've got these things that are very dedicated. I mean, you could talk about T-Rex because it's very well known, but you've got velociraptors, you've got marine reptiles, you have got all sorts of organisms in the oceans that are predatory and on land. You've got all these things that nobody knows about because they haven't taken paleontology class yet. But for those of us who have, there's a lot that you could pick besides T-Rex, a whole lot.
There was a very interesting paper that was published, I think, about 10 years ago. A mainstream, paper. It was in the Proceedings of the National Academy, and they were basically looking at morphological traits which are typically associated with plant eating, with herbivory, and they found that there were 21 morphological traits associated with plant eating that they actually found quite widespread throughout the group of dinosaurs known as coelurosaurs, which, you know, they're theropods, right? So they're these guys. And it was really fascinating because they said it kind of suggests that actually hypercarnivory in these theropod groups was relatively rare, probably secondarily derived. There was evidence that maybe, you know, that the carnivory came later. Now, from a creationist perspective, that's really interesting because from a creationist perspective, that's basically what we would have to say. We would have to say these guys were not eating meat in the Garden of Eden or wherever they were on the pre-flood world. But perhaps we can get some insights from these from the distribution of these morphological traits that maybe that's not such a far-fetched idea as you might imagine.
I think your point about Genesis 9 is really important in my mind, given the number of parallels there between the creation account and then the post-flood account, the way the waters subside, the way God, you know, brings out the land, and the way he talks to Noah, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, exactly the same thing he said to Adam. So there's many of these parallels that go through there that I think can help both to sort of help you understand what it is for Noah to come into this post-flood world, right? It is like it was for Adam when the world was brand new, which again to me suggests that this is not a, unless you think Genesis 1 is all about, you know, just the Garden of Eden, I'm thinking this is not, these things are global, universal passages that are describing these events. All right, well, how about another question here? And I'm going to go for one of our viewers' questions here. This is going to be interesting. I don't know if anybody will know this, but we'll try it. Within John Walton's model, and I would say, preface that with, John Walton has a lot of things in his model, and some of them I think he's right on the money, and a lot of them I think he's gone off the deep end. But all right. Within John Walton's model, can we properly know that the diagram he likes to use for the ancient Near Eastern view of the world, with the dome sky, right, and the waters above, and then the flat plate of the earth, and then the waters under the earth, the chaos waters down there, can we know that that diagram was how the people of the ancient Near East believed was the reality of the world? Or is it possible that this diagram is merely a religious or artistic expression? Thoughts?
Tricky one there. Let's see. I've got a couple of Walton's books over here. And one of the things that I think is interesting, because this diagram is showing up in a lot of places lately within evangelicalism. Walton certainly uses it, and he uses it again in the new volume that Wheaton faculty produced for their Origins course, basically a theistic evolutionary perspectives course. And you even find it in things like Logos Bible software as kind of the default way. BioLogos makes a lot of use of this diagram as well. And as far as perhaps, Todd, you know more about this than I do. I don't know. But the first time this particular diagram shows up within the context of kind of talking about how ancient Israelites viewed the world is the 1900s. As far as this kind of sketch with the rocks down below in the waters and the stars that are fixed to this hardened firmament, it shows up as an illustration in the 1900s, and has just been kind of recopied and done more nicely by some over the last 100 years. Now, I know it's got some connections back to an ancient Babylonian map of the world, that itself is quite stylized in other sorts of ways. So it's questionable whether or not this map of the Babylonians is reflective of the ancient Near East as a whole, or whether it's more polemical for the Babylonians themselves. After all, it puts Babylon in the center of the world. So, kind of pointing out their importance in their perspective, and whether or not that's a real thought of the way the world worked, or whether it was some sort of religious construction that had a different purpose, I think is still quite an open question, even just for the Babylonian side, never mind applying it to the Hebrews.
Yeah, I think the quest to reconstruct the ancient mindset is really interesting, potentially very helpful, but fraught with a lot of speculation, shall we say. I don't think that the kind of certitude that Walton presents, this is how they viewed it. The end. I don't think that reflects reality very much at all. In the sense of, the certainty far more than his data would allow. He is speculating beyond what we know. Paul, did you want to chime in on that?
Well, I mean, one of the questions in my mind is whether there is a certain degree of intentional ambiguity in the biblical text on, some of these things, in the sense that someone in the ancient world who had a kind of outmoded, inaccurate view of the cosmos could read the text and wouldn't necessarily come away thinking my view of the cosmos is incorrect. But it's not necessarily that's what the text is teaching. It's, he might, an ancient reader perhaps might have, as just assumed that model of the cosmos, and maybe the biblical text wouldn't have challenged it. But that's some way from saying that the Bible teaches that the ancient cosmology is correct. I think it uses ambiguous language because it was written, to ancient readers. It's also for us, of course, but yes. It was written also to the ancient reader.
Yes.
And the real, the message of the Bible was not primarily to challenge an inaccurate view of the physical nature of the earth on which the ancient reader was living. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if that's helpful. I'm kind of thinking out loud a little bit there, but
no, I think you're on the right track. I will say, reading some of the early church fathers, there is a belief in the solid dome of the heavens, and the rakia, particularly the word in the Hebrew word in Genesis 1 that's translated as expanse or sky, or the firmament. There are those who would say, and in the ancient world, they would understand, some of them at least, in the early church period, would understand it as a dome. And I'm thinking here specifically of Theophilus of Antioch and his commentary on Genesis. Letters to Autolycus is where he addresses this. But yeah, I think there is intentional ambiguity, and I think it's quite misleading to claim that the scripture teaches this particular view of the cosmos when there is no place in the scripture that sits down and says, all right, listen up now, I'm going to teach you the structure of the cosmos, and then spells it out for you. That's not there. And so it's I think it troubles me, because I think Paul's on the right track. There's this remarkable ambiguity to a lot of this language, so that you can read it as one position on the structure of the cosmos, and you wouldn't think anything of it, and you read it with a completely different perspective on the structure of the cosmos, and you wouldn't think anything of it, because it's intended to speak to everyone at all times. But you have to really have a high view. I don't know that I should say that, but I think you have to have kind of a high view of inspiration to be able to make that claim, where you're looking beyond just the circumstances of its composition to all people of all time and how they are going to understand it. So some of you might have noticed trains coming by. I will say sorry. Our offices are located right next to the railroad tracks, so I hear another one coming. They're only loud very briefly as they go right by. Maybe I'll pause here. All right, let's see here. How about this one? How do you propose meat-eating dinosaurs? Back to the dinosaurs. Everybody loves dinosaurs. How do you propose meat-eating dinosaurs that were created as plant eaters changed their morphology in a few thousand years between the fall and their deposit in Noah's flood? Riddle me this. Anybody?
That's that, Marcus.
Thanks, Paul.
Uh-huh.
So, as I mentioned a little bit before, right, there's kind of two broad perspectives within creationism on this. One is that there was a kind of wholesale reorganization at the time of the fall. That the fall is much bigger than Adam and Eve and the serpent and the circumstances surrounding those three players, but that it is cosmic, not only in the now existence of sin within, but also the consequences of the curse are themselves cosmic. Traditionally, those who hold to that idea, and I'll put myself in that category as well, look to the curse on the serpent for some support there, as it tells us that the serpent is cursed above or more than all the cattle. So that terminology for cattle largely referring to just domestic animals of various types, but in talking about the serpent and the cattle, it seems to extend out to all the beasts of the field, the creeping things, that nature. So, how is it that the serpent can be cursed more than all the cattle? On your belly you'll go, and dust you'll eat all the days of your life. And so we have this sense that this might be the time when snakes were thrown down to be limbless. The Bible is not explicit about that, but seems rather implicit about it. But also, that seems like, okay, but this is special to you, but everybody else is cursed as well. How is that the case? Certainly, I think that if Adam and Eve are then ejected out of the garden into a world that includes carnivorous organisms with which they were unfamiliar prior to the events of the fall, that brings on kind of a full shock value of what the consequences of sin are. If, on the other hand, the other perspective is that this was a gradual degradation, and so really in that case, over the course of Adam and Eve's life, they would see the world decay into violence over time, and the message of sin wouldn't be quite as full up front, but it would be a consistent, constant, inescapable reminder that things are just not getting any better. They're getting worse. So both creationists have fallen into both camps on that one. Others will say a third camp is that the creation was effectively preloaded, that you had animals that were going to be carnivorous. And because the fall happened so quickly after creation, you effectively had carnivores there ready to go. And they, I guess, acted upon their impulses. I'm not sure. I haven't thought through that perspective quite as much. But you've got to go with a real fast fall, like, day 7.5, or 8.2 for the fall. Otherwise, you've got too many organisms that are going to be too hungry too quick before the fall, in my perspective. So you've either got to do it right away, or the other two options are the ones that are available. I kind of favor God reorganizing things, in part because when I take a look at somebody like this, and I look at all the kind of intricate components that are part of making Velociraptor what it is, with the sickle claws, the long lower extremities for speed, the stiffened rods on the tail for balance and agility, big, huge, rapacious claws on the hands. Everything about this animal screams carnivory. As Paul had said, kind of a hyper-carnivore sort of thing. Modern-day cats, same sort of thing. There's nothing about a cat that says lettuce. There's nothing there. Its molars are these little tiny buttons in the back. I mean, it's sad that we feed it cat food because they really can't chew.
And they're very insulted if you give them lettuce.
What's that?
They're very insulted if you give them lettuce.
As well they ought be. I have a lovely neighbor's cat who likes us better than the neighbors, and so I now call him my own. And we feed him the kibbles, but I can see in his eyes there's a disappointment there.
Yes, cats have that great judgmental look. All right, so folks, I just wanted to mention right here in the middle, I know our video is dropping out for a lot of you, and you're getting a lot of buffering problems, and I do apologize for that. I think that the recording will actually record the whole thing. I think that's right. And so if you are able to watch the rewind when we're done, you might be able to pick up some of the missed material. So I apologize, but this is our internet, so we do the best we can. But we will carry on.
I propose, Todd, if I could propose something, we all three of us could sit there and do this.
Yes, right.
Just to...
Great. All right.
Paul won't participate, but we'll do it.
All right. So there's a number of interesting questions coming up here, and I am going to jump to this one because there's a lot of sin in the fall questions, which is supposed to be technically the next discussion session tomorrow morning. So we'll hold those off till then.
Be written in a straightforward way that's reporting things that happened with real characters and real events. The Toledot formula, seems to connect Genesis 1 to 11 to the rest of the text of Genesis. So I don't see the hallmarks of myth in the text of Genesis 1 to 11. That would be my answer if it was a Christian who was asking them. If it was a non-believer, maybe we'd take a different tack. I don't know whether you have any thoughts on that, either of you.
Yeah, it seems like to me it seems like a loaded question because I'm not sure what a myth is, right? So people would use the term myth in a very simplistic way, just to mean it's not true, or they might be, drawing on some idea that Genesis is the same as, say, the Gilgamesh epic, or the same as the Greek gods and Jupiter and all that stuff. I guess that's Roman anyway. And then you might have someone who is sort of a professional folklore anthropologist who would have a very specific understanding of what a myth is supposed to be. In our modern world, myth would be something like the Avengers, or Star Wars, or Star Trek. There's all sorts of myths that in the sort of the anthropological sense reflect cultural values in these stories of these larger than life characters. And so how do you address the question of mythology in Genesis? I suppose would depend on what kind of mythology you think is present. And for me, I'd say the most common one that I run into is this notion that Genesis is very much parallel and dependent on and drawing on the mythology of the ancient Near East, that there's really nothing new in Genesis 1 through 11, and it's basically all copied, but it's copied in a way that is monotheistic and is teaching sort of the absolute power of God. And so there's a theology comment there, but it's still like watching a Christian version of the Avengers, which sounds terrible when I say that, but there it is. So, and my, I look at the ancient Near East literature from which this, the writer of Genesis is supposed to have been, dependent or copying or referencing or whatever. And I just see striking, startling differences from top to bottom. There's usually maybe one or two point of contact, and then the rest of it is just wildly, wildly different. Not even close. You get poetry versus the prose of Genesis. You get all this weird stuff happening, just so many other events, to the point where, the point of contact, the parallels seem trivial and irrelevant. And I think, why would you even think that's an important thing? I don't understand this. I think especially of the Sumerian king list. So the Sumerian king list is basically this clay prism, I guess is what you call it, for long lifespans. Right? I mean, they remember it, but they, they just have their own distorted cultural memories that have exaggerated things, and so it's no longer really the same. And that's basically the point of contact there. There's a disaster. There's a series of disasters. The gods try to wipe out humanity multiple times in the Gilgamesh epic. The flood is only one of them. So even that point is different from what you see in the scripture. It's not the same. So, all the hype about the similarities of the ancient Near Eastern literature and mythology to the scripture, I just find really strange. I don't get it. I'm not a literature guy, I guess. Maybe that's my problem. I don't know.
And I think you made an important point that from a creation perspective, the parallels such as they are not entirely unexpected, because these are pieces of literature that date from relatively early, soon after the flood, and they're drawing on a shared history. They're drawing on memories of real events and things that happened. So it's not surprising, I think, to see these cultures, having some things in common with one another in terms of their stories and with legendary and mythic accretion involved. I don't really see that it's a huge problem.
Yeah, I definitely don't see it as a huge, gigantic problem. Well, we are coming down to it. Got about 20 minutes left, I guess. I guess that's not quite close to the end. So let's have a question like this one. Do you think there are marks of the original creation in living things? Can we actually? So you were talking about the jars of wine in Cana, right? So, and there, if you were there and making careful observations, you could sort of extrapolate back what happened to an extent. So, what then would you say about living things? Could there be evidences left of the actual original creation, such that there's just no other way to explain it? Anybody have a thought on that? Marcus looks puzzled.
Well, as far as living things go, within creationism, we think that there's been quite a bit of change since the original creation. Certainly when it comes to things like carnivory that we've already talked about, one way or the other, there's been some substantial changes between the way that organisms were created as herbivorous at the beginning, and by the time we get to the flood, we already see extensive carnivory, and in the modern world, very extensive. So there's no doubt some remnant evidence of their createdness, but there's also been this very strong overprinting of of their cursing and the subsequent history that they've had. And likewise with our herbivores, there's at least been some long protracted period of history in which they have changed within their kinds to the point of the species that we see here today. I'll at least say I'm not a biologist in that I study very dead biology, right? Stuff that doesn't smell bad anymore is what I tend to look at, which is great. So when I start talking about biology, it's usually on the organismal level, and I try and stay a little further afield from, say, the genetic stuff. But the fact that they were created and are still here, I think, if nothing else, tells me, yeah, there's got to be something for us to be looking for. It's not a dead end, and whether that's in the complexities of their genetic code or whether it's in certain biochemical structures inside the cell, those are places to look. Modern day ecologies, maybe not so much, because they're the result of one of those where Eden was, or parts of Eden. Could we be harvesting the veins of gold that provided gold in the original pre-flood world, which would be kind of cool to think about. They've obviously been beveled and stripped and reworked, but we still have stuff out there. There's still gold that's found, and it's all in Precambrian basement stuff, right? Unless it's been reworked into higher units, like in some sedimentary rocks. So that just is the sort of thing that made me smile as I thought about the question. Like, well, yeah, there are remnants, and heck, it might be here, somewhere. Maybe not the titanium. But
mine's got meteorite on it, so I'm really far back to creation.
Man,
yeah,
very
come
good.
on. I'm gonna have to make one out of a Petoskey stone or something.
There you go.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point that Marcus makes, because just as with organisms, we're kind of having to peel back layers of history to try to, reconstruct what things were like originally. We have exactly the same problem in geology, because we've got to go through all the post-flood events, and then you've got the flood itself, and then you've got the pre-flood world to get back to that original creation and to try to reconstruct what that world was like. And I think we do have some clues. Actually, the Bible doesn't give us very many clues. It gives us some, but it's surprising how few clues there are about that original world. For example, take the fact that we know in the pre-flood world there were high hills, because we're told that the high hills were covered in the flood. But the Bible doesn't tell us anything about those pre-flood high hills. How high were they?
Right.
Where were they located? What shape were they? We don't know anything about those. The only way we can really try to find out those things is to turn to geology and try to look at some of the clues from the geological record. And it might be that we actually have some remnants of those original, pre-flood mountains. I know, Kurt Wise has pointed out there are ancient remnants of mountains like the Ozarks and others, where they're actually rather unusual kind of mountain ranges, because they're not linear mountain ranges like the ones that were formed by plate tectonics during the flood. They're kind of circular mountain ranges, and he suggests maybe they were formed by some kind of non-plate tectonic process. Maybe there were different processes at work during creation week to form those mountains. So maybe we can get some clues about the pre-flood world, but it's very difficult, because we're peeling back all those layers of history to try to get there.
So speaking of created kinds, I might have to field this one. What is the difference between species and kinds? Like when you were talking about species fixity not being true, but the kinds can change, what is the difference between species and kinds? Are you both looking at me now?
Yeah.
Well, the older I get and the more I study this, the more puzzled I am by what in the world species are to begin with. they seem very stable in the sense that over generations, the offspring tend to look like their parents and so forth. They also tend to be remarkably ephemeral. And by that I mean that if you stress them in certain ways, then the species will change. It will perhaps combine with another species and produce something completely different. It might go extinct. So I'm thinking here about not necessarily evolution, but I'm thinking about a lot of early work that was done in the 1700s prior to Darwin coming along, 1700s, early 1800s, prior to Origin. And there, people, you had Linnaeus and his predecessors who basically said, are fine, and you can make more generations of these puppies. You can have a quarter wolf, 3/4 dog. You can have a 3/4 wolf, 1/4 dog, depending on how you breed them. And the famous example being the mule that is sterile, which was used to argue that God created these unviolable, these unpassable boundaries of these species. Well, that turns out to be quite rare. And even especially in the plant world, people in the early 1800s breeding plants for sport, they began realizing, goodness, you can take things that are in different genera, which are even bigger than species, more different than species, and cross them and get fertile offspring. And so there was this realization that the permanence and stability of species is not very much at all. And now in the modern world, we can see and track some of these changes and see how hybridization can lead to new things. Hybridization can transform a species. Even modern people, right? Neanderthals, we have genetics from them. And so for me, I'm coming back to the question of, well, then what in the world is a species anyway? If they're so fragile, how are they able to maintain themselves? And what is the permanence? Because at the same time that there is this fluidity to species, there's also this remarkable consistency to groups of species. I know a dog when I see it. I know a bear when I see it. I know a cat when I see it. Even when you're watching a sci-fi movie and you see some creature come across the screen, you can tell where they got those ideas, right? Oh, that's a spider, or oh, that's a bulldog, or whatever. You can see they just put the face on it, that's an octopus, whatever. You put suction cups on them. There's this ability to recognize this stability. So there is this simultaneous stability and flexibility in creation. And for me, that just sort of necessitates a new way of thinking about things, right? So, and that way is sort of the middle ground between evolution and absolute species fixity. And when you think about it, species fixity is a pretty terrible model. If your species can't adapt ever for anything, then the only solution for them is extinction when anything changes. So after the flood, everything should have died out. Period. But they didn't. So clearly God made species pretty resilient. So all of that, yeah, but then you still have the stability and the constancy and the ability to recognize the traces of organisms, regardless of what sort of manifestation they might have in a particular species. You could recognize the higher groups. And so, yeah, for me, the Baraminology model, the created kind, is the way to explain that. Yes, there is flexibility in species, no question about that. But at the same time, there's the constancy of the created kind, which is a higher group, right? So what we see today as cats, multiple different cats, lions, tigers, ocelots, pumas, panthers, jaguars, all those guys, those are all one created kind, and the reason that they have the catness about them is because they come from that single created kind, and some would argue that that means that they share a common ancestor, an ancestral pair on Noah's Ark. So I'm not sure that that really gets at the whole explanation of what a created kind is. I don't think we have a very good grasp, or even still a very good grasp or understanding exactly what a created kind is, but that's kind of where we're going with it. The idea that you do have a great deal of flexibility in organisms and species, but that there's always this sort of common core or common center about which the species can vary, but they don't vary very far. Is that good enough? What do you guys think?
I think the ability to identify particular species within sci-fi movies increases with decreasing budget.
Yes. Oh, look, it's an iguana tearing apart a model railroad.
That's right. What do you know? That Triceratops is really just a horned toad. And the guy with the big giant bug head, well, we're watching The Fly, so you know that makes sense.
Right.
You obviously grew up watching the same films that I did.
Yeah.
Oh, very good. Saturday afternoons are delightful. Absolutely delightful.
All right, here's a good one. I don't know that this is going to be anything that we're going to... Maybe it will. Do you think God placed Earth in the sun's orbit on day 1 or on day 4 as he made the sun?
Wow. I have no idea.
I mean, technically, for an orbit, you only need a gravity center, right? You don't actually need a sun. You just need something big and dense to orbit.
Yeah, I'm always slightly reluctant, when we're dealing with Creation Week, to kind of get too in the weeds with precise mechanics of everything that's going on, because we're obviously in the realm of the miraculous there. God is doing things using processes and mechanisms and time scales that we're not used to studying scientifically. So it's a bit difficult to answer questions like that, I think.
Yeah. And I would say if it is in orbit, it's probably not the sun, because the sun didn't exist, right? So at least that's my understanding of the text anyway. So, oh good, here comes another train just at closing time. So let me close up tonight. Thank you guys. I'll see you tomorrow for our next session, which we're going to try to focus on the fall and its effects on creation. Let me mention here our speakers. Most of you probably know this, but if you don't, there's Paul Garner's book, New Creationism. This is available on Amazon. Dr. Ross as a Monster. This is a geology textbook or earth science textbook, and this is a second edition. Have you got a new edition coming?
Not yet.
Okay.
No, we're still on the second, so that's still good.
That's the new one. All right.
That's right.
Oh, three in 1 hour. This is my life. All right. 3 trains, and then my book, The Quest. Lots of people like it. I'm a terrible salesman. I guess some people like it. I don't know, but you should get it because it's cool. I would like that. All right. That's that. Tomorrow's the fall. And thank you all for joining us. And I am going to close it out tonight. Good night, everybody. And
thanks a bunch, Todd.
See you in the morning.
Good night to everyone. See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.